What happens when a quiet claim from a humble waitress shatters a billionaire's reality? In the gilded heart of London, inside a restaurant where fortunes are decided over truffle-laced entrees, a young woman's simple words, "I speak 9 languages," are met with arrogant laughter. That laughter from a man who could buy the entire city block echoed for a moment before being silenced by a single sentence from her. A sentence spoken not in a familiar tongue, but in a dead language that carried a ghost from a buried past. This isn't just a story about languages. It's about how the quietest person in the room can hold the loudest truth. Aurelia wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. Tucked away in a quiet cobblestone mews in Mayfair, London, it was a sanctuary for the world's elite. The air inside hummed with a low, expensive frequency, the clinking of hand-cut crystal, the whisper of bespoke suits against velvet banquettes, the subtle scent of saffron and old money. Here, deals worth more than small nations were sealed with a nod, and secrets were traded like canapes. And in the center of this opulent stage, moving with a grace that made her almost invisible, was Jessie. To the patrons, she was simply part of the exquisite decor, a waitress, efficient and silent. Her uniform, a simple but perfectly tailored black dress, was immaculate. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face, pale and serious, rarely broke into a smile. She was good at her job. So good, in fact, that she could anticipate a need before it was spoken. A refilled glass of Sancerre, a fresh napkin, the removal of a finished plate. This quiet, almost monastic discipline was her armor. Anonymity was her fortress. For 3 years, Jessie had cultivated this invisibility. She had fled a life of chaos and complexity for the simple, predictable rhythm of service. The clatter of the kitchen was her metronome, the flow of orders her script. She spoke when spoken to, her English crisp and faintly accented, though no one could ever place the accent. It was this ambiguity that she cherished. She was from nowhere and everywhere. Tonight, however, the theater of Aurelia had a new star performer. His name was Khalid Al-Jamil. He wasn't just wealthy, he was a force of nature. A Saudi real estate and technology magnate, his name was a headline, his face a fixture on the covers of Forbes and The Economist. When he entered Aurelia with his 2 stern-faced associates, a ripple of recognition and deference flowed through the room. The owner, Mr. Dubois, a man who prided himself on his unflappable composure, personally escorted them to the best table in the house. Table 12, nestled in a discreet alcove with a commanding view of the entire establishment. Jessie was assigned their section. It was a test, a vote of confidence from Dubois. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, a feeling she constantly fought to suppress. Men like Al-Jamil were not just customers. They were gravitational forces, bending the world around them to their will. They noticed everything, and their gaze felt like an audit. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Aurelia," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur as she presented the leather-bound menus. Khalid Al-Jamil didn't even look at her. He was busy with his phone, his thumb flicking across the screen with impatient energy. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, a perfectly trimmed beard, and a restless energy that seemed barely contained by his custom-made Zegna suit. A platinum Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist, catching the soft light of the chandelier. "We will start with a bottle of the 82 Waitress," he said, not to Jessie, but to the room at large. His voice was a deep baritone, laced with the command of a man who had never been told no. One of his associates, a sharp-eyed man named Ferris, nodded curtly at her to signal the order. Jessie inclined her head slightly. "An excellent choice, sir." She retrieved the wine from the temperature-controlled cellar, her movements fluid and practiced. The ritual of presenting the bottle, uncorking it with the softest of sighs and pouring a small tasting sample was a familiar dance. It was predictable. It was safe. Khalid finally put down his phone, picked up the glass and swirled the deep crimson liquid. He didn't taste it. He just looked at Jessie, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if seeing her for the first time. It was a look she knew well, dismissal mixed with a flicker of curiosity. He was cataloging her, the simple uniform, the lack of makeup, the plainness of her existence compared to his. "Tell me," he said, his voice smooth as silk but with an edge of steel. He switched to flawless Parisian French, asking a pointed question about the venison's authenticity, questioning if it was truly from the Scottish Highlands or just a story for tourists. Without missing a beat, Jessie replied in the same perfect French. She confirmed its origin from the Balmoral estate, noting it had arrived that morning and that the chef recommended it with the blackberry and juniper reduction. A flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected it. He had used language as a subtle tool of power, a way to create an exclusive space, assuming the hired help wouldn't be able to enter. Jessie had just walked through the door without knocking. He wasn't done. He turned to his other associate and began speaking in rapid, formal Mandarin about quarterly projections. Jessie, while clearing the bread plates, noticed a slight error in the man's response, a misplaced decimal point in his verbal report. As she moved away from the table, she paused. It was a breach of her carefully constructed anonymity, a risk she knew she shouldn't take. But the precision was an old habit, a ghost of a former life. In a low, discreet voice, she interjected in the same precise Mandarin. She corrected the associate, explaining that the projection was for a 1.8% increase, not 0.8%, and noted it was a significant difference for the technology acquisitions portfolio. The entire table went silent. The two associates stared at her, their mouths slightly agape. Ferris looked mortified. Khalid al-Jamil, however, slowly put his wineglass down. The restlessness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. The game had just become interesting. He saw a waitress, but he was starting to suspect there was something more. He had no idea how much more. Well, he murmured in English, the smile not reaching his eyes. "It seems we have a polyglot in our midst." Jessie simply bowed her head. "I am here to ensure you have a pleasant evening, sir." But she knew with a sinking feeling that her pleasant, anonymous evening was over. The fortress she had built around herself had just been breached, not by force, but by a few careless, expertly spoken words of her own. The dinner progressed like a calculated chess match. Khalid al-Jamil was no longer just a diner. He was an interrogator, and the weapon he wielded was language. With every course, he switched tongues, a casual display of his global reach and education, but also a deliberate, pointed test. When the appetizers arrived, seared scallops with a parsnip puree, he posed a question about the wine pairing in fluid, Florentine Italian. Jessie responded with a detailed explanation in the same dialect, outlining how the crisp acidity of the gavi cut through the richness of the shellfish. During the main course, the Highland venison he had questioned, he switched to Russian. He discussed a recent oil deal in Siberia with his associates, peppering his speech with technical jargon before directing a question at Jessie about the restaurant's history, clearly expecting her to falter. She answered in calm, measured Russian. She explained that the building was originally the winter residence of a famous Russian count before the revolution, and that legend said his ghost still complained about the quality of the vodka. His associates chuckled nervously. Khalid did not. The smile remained fixed on his face, but his eyes were like chips of obsidian. He was a man who collected rare and valuable things, art, companies, properties. And he was beginning to look at Jessie with the acquisitive gleam of a collector who had just stumbled upon an uncatalogued masterpiece. This wasn't just a party trick. The depth and authenticity of her accents were astonishing. He was testing her limits, trying to find the edge of her knowledge. He tried German, posing a complex question about Kantian philosophy, and she answered simply and correctly. He tried Spanish, referencing a line from a Lorca poem, and she completed the stanza without hesitation. With each successful parry, the tension at the table grew. His associates, Ferris and Omar, watched the exchange with a mixture of awe and terror. They were used to their boss dominating every room he entered. Tonight, a quiet waitress was meeting his every challenge, not with defiance, but with a calm, unshakable competence that was somehow more unsettling. Jessie felt the walls closing in. Each language she spoke was a brick being removed from her fortress of anonymity. These languages were not trophies to her. They were scars, Each one learned in a different city, a different life, a different chapter of the past she had run so hard to escape. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Language is not a tool, Jessie. It is a key. It can open any door, but be careful which doors you open. Some are meant to stay locked. Finally, as Jessie cleared the main course plates, Khalid leaned forward, placing his elbows on the pristine white tablecloth. The pretense was gone. His voice was low for their table only, but it carried an undeniable weight of command. "This is quite a performance," he said in English, his tone dripping with cynical amusement. "Tell me, where does a waitress in Mayfair acquire such an extensive collection of languages? A summer course at the local college?" The condescension was a physical blow. Jessie stiffened, her knuckles white as she gripped the stack of plates. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons, the worried glance from Mr. Dubois near the entrance. She had two choices: retreat, apologize, and fade back into the wallpaper, or stand her ground. Something inside her, a long dormant flicker of pride from a life before this one, made the choice for her. She placed the plate silently on her service tray. She turned to face him, her gaze meeting his directly for the first time. Her eyes, which he had first dismissed as plain, now held a depth he couldn't quite fathom. "It was not a course, sir," she said, her voice even and clear, devoid of emotion. "It was a life." She paused, and then she delivered the simple, unadorned truth. "I speak 9 languages." The statement hung in the air for a moment. 9. Not 3 or 4, which would be impressive. 9 was an extraordinary claim. It bordered on the absurd. And then it happened. Khalid al-Jamil threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a loud, booming, unrestrained laugh of pure disbelief and ridicule. It was the laugh of a man who believed he had finally caught his opponent in a ridiculous bluff. The sound cut through the hushed ambiance of Aurelia like a shattered window. Diners at other tables turned to stare. Mr. Dubois took a panicked step forward. 9? Khalid choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. He looked at Ferris and Omar. "Did you hear that? 9 languages. My dear girl, even the top UN translators would find that a stretch. What are you counting? Pig Latin?" His associates offered weak, sycophantic smiles, but Jessie didn't flinch. She didn't blush or look away. She simply stood there, a statue of composure, and let his laughter wash over her. It was a familiar feeling, the scorn of powerful men who saw her as nothing more than what she appeared to be. The humiliation was a hot coal in her gut, but her face remained a mask of serene professionalism. The laughter died down, leaving an awkward, ringing silence in its wake. Khalid, still smirking, leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "All right then, humor me. Let's hear the list. What's number 9? Klingon?" His tone was mocking, playful, but his eyes were sharp. This was the final move in his game. He was going to expose her, to turn her quiet confidence into a public embarrassment. Jessie took a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the room felt thick, charged with anticipation. She was about to open a door she had sworn to keep locked forever, but his laughter had been the turning of a key she no longer controlled. "The 9th, she said, her voice barely audible, but cutting through the silence, "is a language I doubt you would find on any curriculum." His smirk widened. "Try me." She held his gaze, and for a fleeting second, the waitress from Aurelia vanished, replaced by someone older, someone who had seen too much. The ghost of her father's warning whispered in her ear. Some doors are meant to stay locked. It was too late. The challenge had been issued. The lock was about to break. The smirk on Khalid al-Jamil's face was one of absolute certainty. He was a hunter who had cornered his prey, and he was ready to enjoy the final moments of the chase. He gestured magnanimously with his hand, a king granting a final, foolish request. "The stage is yours," he said, his voice laced with theatrical generosity. "Impress me. What other hidden talents do you possess? Let's move past the common tongues. You've demonstrated your European and Asian basics. What else is in your repertoire?" He was baiting her, pushing her to name a language so obscure he could instantly dismiss it. Farsi, perhaps? Or Swahili? He was an expert in exposing charlatans, people who claimed expertise to curry favor. It was a survival skill in his world. Jessie's mind raced. She could list them: English, French, Italian, Russian, Mandarin, German, Spanish, Arabic, and the ninth, the one she never spoke, the one that tasted of dust and grief. It was tied to the very life she had abandoned. Naming it felt like a betrayal of the quiet existence she had fought so hard to build. "Let me guess," Khalid continued, tapping an impatient rhythm on the table with his manicured fingernails. "You picked up some Hebrew on a gap year? A little Portuguese from a holiday romance?" The goading was relentless. He was trying to chip away at her composure. "I am fluent in modern standard Arabic," she stated calmly, meeting his gaze. This gave him pause. His smirk faltered for a half-second. Arabic was his native tongue, a language of immense complexity and nuance. It was a bold claim. "Is that so?" he purred. He shifted to the elegant, poetic Arabic of scholars, a dialect far removed from the common street vernacular. He wove a proverb about how the tongue can paint what the eyes can't see, but a shallow river makes the most noise, clearly challenging her to show her depth. Jessie's response was immediate, her accent not of a foreigner who had studied the language, but of someone who had lived it. Her dialect was a crisp, educated Levantine, the kind spoken in the old academic circles. She replied in the same high dialect with a counter-proverb, stating that the deepest rivers flow in silence, and that it is not the noise that proves the water's power, but its ability to carve stone. The flow of poetry, the perfect cadence, the subtle cultural reference, it was flawless. Ferris and Omar exchanged a genuinely shocked look. This was beyond linguistic skill. This was cultural immersion. Khalid's amusement had now completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating curiosity. The game was no longer fun. This woman was not a charlatan. She was something else entirely. But what? Who was she? "Very good," he conceded, his voice tight. He drummed his fingers again, his mind working furiously. He had traveled the world, met with heads of state, negotiated with the cleverest minds in finance and technology. He had never encountered a mystery like this in a restaurant. "You have a gift, but you claim 9. That was your number. So far you have confirmed 8. What is the 9th? The one you are so reluctant to name?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping so low she could barely hear it. "What are you hiding?" Jessie felt a chill snake down her spine. The question was too close to the truth. She was hiding everything. Her name, her past, her father's legacy. She looked at his face, at the arrogant certainty that he could unravel any puzzle, and a spark of defiance ignited within her. The same defiance her father had possessed, the intellectual fire that had been both his greatest gift and his ultimate downfall. She would not name the language. She would lead him to the door and let him use his own key. "It is a language of history," she said cryptically, "of scholars and lost kingdoms. It is rarely spoken today." Khalid's eyes narrowed. He was now thoroughly intrigued. The multi-billion-dollar deal he was in London to close completely forgotten. This was a different kind of negotiation, a more personal one. He began to cycle through possibilities in his mind. Aramaic, Coptic, these were academic languages, but not impossible. He decided to set one final trap, one he was certain she could not escape. It was a trap from his own history, a fragment of a secret world he shared with very few. His grandfather spoke a specific, almost extinct dialect of Neo-Aramaic, a tongue that had survived for millennia in a few isolated mountain villages. It was a family language, a secret code. There were perhaps fewer than 100 speakers left in the world. Khalid leaned back, affecting an air of finality. He looked at Jessie, and in that strange, archaic tongue, he spoke. The words were guttural and ancient, full of hard consonants and flowing vowels. It was a short, rhythmic phrase that sounded like a line of bleak poetry, a coded message that meant, "The hawk is cold, for the wood is in the dust." It was nonsense to an outsider. He watched her, a triumphant glint in his eye, expecting a blank stare, a confused frown, the final, satisfying admission of her lie. Jessie stood frozen for a beat. The world around her seemed to slow down. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, it all faded into a distant hum. She heard not the voice of the billionaire in front of her, but the soft, patient voice of her father years ago, in a dusty study. He was holding an old book, tracing the strange script. Listen, Jessie, this is not just a language. It is a memory, a key to a locked room. You must remember the exact phrases. They are more important than any gold. The air left her lungs in a quiet rush. Of all the languages in the world, he had chosen that one. The one from her nightmares. The one that led back to the day her world had shattered. Khalid's smirk began to return. He had her. She was bluffing after all. And then she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, but it seemed to shake the very air between them. Her own words mirrored his in rhythm and sound, an unmistakable answer in the same dead language. She replied with a phrase that was the other half of the code, the only possible response. A counterline of verse that meant, "But the fire is warm, in the sun of the eagle." The moment the answer left Jessie's lips, the universe of Khalid al-Jamil tilted on its axis. It was not just a response, it was the only response. A verbal handshake passed down through 3 generations of his family, a code used to confirm the identity of a trusted messenger or the security of a priceless asset. It was a secret kept with paranoid jealousy, known only to his father, himself, and 2 of his most trusted, now deceased family retainers. It was a language spoken by ghosts, and this waitress, in this absurdly expensive London restaurant, had just spoken it as if she were reciting a nursery rhyme. For a long, terrifying second, Khalid did not react. His mind simply refused to process the information. It was an anomaly so profound, a logical impossibility so stark, that his brain stalled. The fork he had been holding, poised above his plate of artisanal cheese, slipped from his grasp. It clattered against the porcelain with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the stunned silence of the table. He froze. It wasn't a figure of speech. His entire body became rigid. The blood drained from his face, leaving his olive skin a ghastly pale gray. His eyes, which had been so full of mockery and power just moments before, were now wide with a dawning, primal horror. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure shock. He looked at her, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a man looks at an apparition, a specter that has just risen from the grave of his most deeply buried secrets. His associates, Ferris and Omar, saw the change instantly. They had worked for Khalid for over a decade. They had seen him angry, seen him triumphant, seen him ruthless. They had never, not once, seen him afraid. Ferris started to rise from his seat. "Sir, Mr. Al-Jamil, are you all right?" Khalid didn't hear him. His entire consciousness was focused on Jessie. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and fear. Who was she? How could she know this? The implications were staggering. It meant his family's deepest security had been compromised. It meant there was a leak, a traitor, somewhere impossibly close to him. Or it meant something far, far worse. The phrase wasn't just a code, it was tied to a specific event, a dark chapter from 20 years ago. The disastrous acquisition of a set of ancient manuscripts his father had tried to purchase from a reclusive European academic, a deal that had gone catastrophically wrong, ending in ruin, accusations of theft, and the disappearance of the academic, a man whose name was a curse in the Al-Jamil household, a man named Professor Andrei Petrov. Jessie watched him, her own heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had done it. She had opened the door. The satisfaction she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by a hollow ache of dread. She saw the journey of realization travel across his face, from shock to disbelief, from disbelief to suspicion, and finally from suspicion to a terrible, dawning recognition. His eyes scanned her face, no longer seeing a waitress, but searching for a ghost. He looked at the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she held her head with a quiet, scholarly stillness. He was searching for a phantom from the past, a face he had only ever seen in a faded 20-year-old photograph, the face of a young girl standing beside her father, Professor Petrov. "Who?" Khalid's voice was a choked, strangled sound, nothing like the confident baritone of before. He struggled to get the words out. "Who are you?" He didn't want the answer. He was terrified of the answer. Jessie did not reply. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The billionaire was helpless, exposed, his world of certainty crumbling around him. The invisible waitress now held all the cards. Mr. Dubois, sensing a crisis far beyond a spilled drink or an unhappy customer, began to hurry towards their table, his face a mask of professional concern. "Is everything all right, Mr. Al-Jamil? Is there a problem?" Khalid raised a trembling hand, waving him away without looking at him. His eyes never left Jessie. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the polished floor. He stood up, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. His two associates rose with him, alarmed and confused. "My office," Khalid rasped, the words directed at Jessie. It wasn't a request, it was a desperate, ragged command. "Not here. Now!" He turned and strode from the dining room, not with his usual commanding swagger, but with the panicked haste of a man fleeing a burning building. Ferris and Omar exchanged a bewildered glance before rushing to follow him. The entire restaurant was now watching. The whispers started, speculating on what could have happened to so thoroughly unnerve the unshakable Khalid Al-Jamil. Jessie remained by the table, alone in the wreckage of the evening. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached down to pick up the fallen fork. The cold silver felt like ice against her skin. She had known this day might come. She had spent years dreading it. The day her past would finally catch up with her. She looked at Mr. Dubois, who was staring at her as if she had sprouted wings. "Mr. Dubois," she said, her voice regaining its steady composure, "I must apologize. I believe I will be taking my break now." He could only nod, speechless. Jessie unfastened her crisp white apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the service tray. She walked out of the grand dining room of Aurelia, leaving the whispers and the stares behind her, and followed the ghost she had just resurrected. She was no longer a waitress, she was a key, walking toward the lock it was made to open. Khalid Al-Jamil's temporary London office was on the 50th floor of the Shard, a glass and steel dagger piercing the night sky. The view was breathtaking, a glittering tapestry of light stretching to the horizon. But tonight, Khalid saw none of it. He stood with his back to the panoramic window, his hands braced on a massive mahogany desk, his knuckles white. The room was a sterile monument to modern power, minimalist furniture, abstract art, and the faint, antiseptic smell of success. Ferris and Omar stood nervously by the door, having been ordered to wait outside the main office but remain close. When Jessie arrived, escorted by Khalid's personal driver, who had been waiting for her outside the restaurant, they looked at her with a new, fearful respect. She was no longer just the waitress, she was the woman who had broken their boss. She entered the office and the heavy door closed behind her, with a soft, definitive click, sealing them inside the silent, high-altitude chamber. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's climate control and the frantic beating of Khalid's heart. He was trying to regain control, to reassemble the shattered pieces of his composure. He was Khalid Al-Jamil. He did not get rattled. He did the rattling. Finally, he turned to face her. The fear in his eyes had receded, replaced by a cold, hard fury. "The games are over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I will ask you one more time. Who are you, and how do you know that code?" Jessie stood in the center of the vast room, looking small and out of place in her simple black uniform. But her posture was straight, her chin was up, and her gaze was unwavering. The fear she had felt earlier had solidified into a grim resolve. "The code was a gift," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "From my father." Khalid's jaw tightened. "Your father's name." It was a command, not a question. "You know his name," she replied. "You've known it for 20 years. You speak it in your house like a curse." She took a breath and spoke the name that had defined and destroyed her life. "My name is Jessie Petrova. My father was Professor Andrei Petrov." The name hit him like a physical blow. He visibly flinched, a wave of memory and inherited hatred washing over him. Andrei Petrov, the brilliant, treacherous linguist and historian, the man who had charmed his father with tales of lost libraries and ancient wisdom, the man who had been entrusted with the family's honor and had, according to the story Khalid had been told his entire life, betrayed them utterly. Petrov! He spat the name like poison. The thief! He was not a thief, Jessie countered, her voice rising with a sudden, fierce heat. For the first time, the calm facade cracked, revealing the raw wound beneath. He was a scholar, a man of integrity, a man your father destroyed. My father? Khalid laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Your father was a charlatan who promised access to the manuscripts, took my family's deposit, a fortune, and then vanished with the collection's most prized possession, the Eagle's Codex. He humiliated my father and stole a piece of our heritage. This was the story he had been raised on, the foundational myth of his family's caution and his father's one great failure. The Eagle's Codex was a legendary manuscript, said to contain pre-Islamic poetry and astronomical charts of unparalleled value. Its loss was a wound that had never healed. Jessie shook her head, a sad, weary gesture. That is the story you were told. It is not the truth. She began to pace the room, the story pouring out of her, a torrent of memory held back for 2 decades. Her voice transported them from the sterile London office to a dusty, book-lined study in a Geneva villa 20 years ago. My father, Andrei Petrov, revered history, she began. He didn't broker deals. He curated legacies. Your father hired him to act as the intermediary to acquire the collection from its reclusive owner. What my father discovered was that the collection was being secretly targeted by another buyer. A man with no regard for history, only for profit and power, a ruthless black market collector named Marcus Thorne. At the mention of the name, Khalid went still. Marcus Thorne. The name was chillingly familiar. It was the name of the very man he was in London to meet tomorrow. The head of Thorne Global, a powerful and aggressive investment firm that was attempting a hostile takeover of one of Al Jamil's key technology subsidiaries. The connection was so unexpected, so jarring, that he felt a wave of dizziness. Thorne wanted the Eagle's Codex, Jessie continued, her voice urgent. He tried to bribe my father. When that didn't work, he threatened him. He threatened me. My father knew that if Thorne got his hands on the Codex, it would disappear into a private vault forever, lost to the world. He also knew Thorne was dangerous, that he had corrupted the sellers. The deal was a trap. She stopped in front of the window, looking out at the city lights, but seeing only the past. So my father acted. He used your father's deposit money not to steal the Codex, but to save it. He secured it and went into hiding, planning to contact your father once the threat from Thorne had passed. But Thorne was clever. He spun a story. He convinced your father that Andrei Petrov was a common thief. He fed your family's pride and their anger, turning them against the one man who was trying to protect their investment. Your father, humiliated and furious, used his vast resources to hunt my father not as an ally, but as a criminal. He froze his accounts, ruined his reputation, and put a price on his head. Her voice broke, thick with unshed tears. We ran, from city to city, country to country. That's where I learned the languages. Each one was a new life, a new camouflage. My father spent the rest of his life in hiding, always looking over his shoulder, his name destroyed, his spirit broken. He died of a heart attack in a small rented room in Lisbon, surrounded by books but stripped of his honor, all because he tried to do the right thing. She turned back to face Khalid, her eyes blazing with the fire of a daughter's righteous fury. Before he died, he taught me everything, the history, the codes, the language of your family. He entrusted the secret of the Codex location to me. He told me that one day the truth would be needed. He said the hawk would grow cold and the eagle's sun would need to bring warmth. He wasn't a thief, Mr. Al-Jamil. He was a guardian. And you, your family, you were hunting the wrong man. The room was silent once more. The carefully constructed narrative of Khalid's life, of his family's honor, of his father's betrayal by a European academic, was dissolving around him. He was left with a horrifying new possibility, that his entire understanding of his past was a lie, And worse, that the villain of his family story, Marcus Thorne, was the very man he was about to walk into a multi-billion-dollar negotiation with, completely unaware of the history that connected them. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, the fury draining out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The waitress hadn't just spoken a dead language. She had resurrected a history he never knew existed, and in doing so, had exposed a danger he was walking into completely blind. The weight of Jesse's story settled in the silent office, heavy and suffocating. For Khalid, it was as if the floor had fallen away, leaving him in a dizzying freefall through 20 years of deception. He stared at Jessie, this woman he had mocked and dismissed just hours ago, and saw the living embodiment of a history he had fundamentally misunderstood. "Thorne," he said, the name tasting foul in his mouth. "Marcus Thorne is the CEO of Thorne Global. They are trying to acquire my AI division, Jamil Innovations. The board meeting is in 2 days. He is known to be aggressive. But this is something else." He shook his head, trying to connect the dots. Why? Why would he go to such lengths? It was 20 years ago. The Codex is just an old book. "To you, perhaps," Jessie countered, stepping closer to the desk. "But not to men like Thorne, and not to my father. The Eagle's Codex isn't just poetry. My father believed it contained coded astronomical data, maps of the desert stars from 1,000 years before accepted science. He said whoever could decipher it could potentially locate lost trade routes, and by extension, undiscovered historical sites. Sites that might contain artifacts, or even, as the legends say, resources. To Thorne, it's not a piece of history, it's a treasure map. He doesn't want to buy your AI division for its technology, Mr. Al-Jamil. He wants to buy it for its data processing power. He needs your company's resources to crack the codex he has been hunting for 2 decades. The revelation hit Khalid with the force of a physical impact. It all made a sickening kind of sense. Thorne's inexplicable, almost obsessive pursuit of his company. The generous, almost too generous offer. It wasn't a standard corporate takeover. It was the endgame of a 20-year obsession. "If what you say is true," Khalid said slowly, his mind racing, "then your father hid the codex. Where is it?" "I don't know," Jessie said simply. Khalid looked up, his eyes flashing with a renewed spark of suspicion. "You don't know? After all this, you're telling me you don't know?" "I don't know its physical location," she clarified, her voice firm. "He never told me. He said it was too dangerous for one person to have both the key and the lock. He gave me the key. The location of the lock is hidden elsewhere." She reached into the pocket of her simple black dress and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook, no bigger than her palm. She placed it on the polished mahogany desk between them. It looked ancient and fragile against the cold, modern surface. "This was his final journal," she said. "It's filled with his research, notes, and a puzzle, a series of linguistic and historical riddles. He said that if I ever met someone who spoke the hawk's cold words, someone from your family who was finally ready to hear the truth, I was to share this with them. The answer to the puzzle," he said, "is the location of the codex." Khalid stared at the small book. This humble object was the nexus of his family's shame, Jesse's lost childhood, and his own impending corporate battle. It was a relic from a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly present. He tentatively reached out and opened the journal. The pages were filled with his father's elegant, spidery script in a dozen different languages, all written in English letters. There were astronomical charts, lines of poetry, and complex diagrams that made no immediate sense. It was the work of a brilliant, labyrinthine mind. "My father could never solve it," Jessie said softly. "He spent the last years of his life trying. He said he was too close to it, too clouded by his own grief and fear. He said it needed 2 perspectives to be solved, the mind of a Petrova and the heritage of an Al-Jamil. He believed the clues within it are tied not just to universal history, but to specific locations and stories from your family's past, stories only a true member of the Al-Jamil line would know. The ultimate twist, the final posthumous move from the brilliant Professor Petrov. He hadn't just hidden the prize. He had created a lock that required the 2 wrong parties, his own bloodline and the family that had hunted him, to work together to open it. It was a forced reconciliation from beyond the grave. Khalid looked up from the journal, his eyes meeting Jesse's. The animosity, the arrogance, the anger, it was all gone. In its place was a shared, stunning realization of their situation. They were not enemies. They had never been enemies. They were two victims of the same man, separated by 2 decades of lies. And that man, Marcus Thorne, was about to close his trap. "He's been playing a long game," Khalid murmured, his voice filled with a grim new understanding. "He used my family's anger to eliminate his rival, my father. And now he's coming to use my family's resources to claim the prize." "He doesn't know about me," Jesse added. "He thinks the secret of the Codex died with my father. I am the variable he never accounted for. The ghost in his machine." Khalid closed the journal and pushed it gently back across the desk toward her. "No," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound authority. But this time, it wasn't the authority of a billionaire over a waitress. It was the authority of a partner. "Not just you. We are the variable." He stood up, his posture once again confident, but it was a different kind of confidence now. It wasn't born of wealth, but of purpose. "He wants a war. We will give him one. But this will not be fought in a boardroom. It will be fought with this." He tapped the leather journal. "He thinks he is acquiring an AI company, but he is about to find himself in a history lesson. The power dynamic had been irrevocably rewritten. An hour ago, he had been a magnet, and she a servant. Now they were something else entirely. She was the keeper of the key, a brilliant scholar in her own right, forged in a crucible of loss and survival. He was the possessor of the heritage, the resources, and the raw power needed to fight back. Separately, they were both vulnerable to Marcus Thorne. Together, they were the one thing Thorne could never have anticipated, a united front. The first light of dawn began to creep over the London skyline, casting long, dramatic shadows across the office. The city was waking up to a new day, but for Khalid and Jesse, the world had been irrevocably remade during the night. The sterile corporate office no longer felt like a billionaire's throne room. It had become a war room, the grand mahogany desk their strategy table. Khalid had been on the phone for the past hour, his voice a low, urgent hum. He moved with a terrifying efficiency, his grief and shock channeled into a laser-focused stream of action. He canceled his morning appointments, postponed a dozen secondary meetings, and instructed his legal team to begin digging into every shadow of Marcus Thorne's corporate and personal history. He spoke in a flurry of different languages, his commands precise and unarguable. Jessie watched him, the small leather journal held tightly in her hands. She had spent a lifetime in the shadows, observing men like him from a safe, servile distance, but now she was seeing the reality behind the facade. The arrogance was a shield, the impatience a symptom of a mind that moved faster than the world around it. Stripped of his false assumptions, Khalid al-Jamil was a formidable force, and for the first time in 20 years, that force was not directed against her family, but against their common enemy. When he finally hung up, he turned to her, his eyes tired but alight with a fierce, brilliant energy. "My security team is sweeping this building and my hotel. Ferris is arranging a secure location for us outside the city. We must assume Thorne has eyes and ears everywhere. From this moment on, we are ghosts." He paused, his gaze resting on her. "You should have been my guest, not my waitress. My family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. An apology is not enough, but it is where I must begin. I am sorry, Jesse, for my arrogance, for my ignorance, and for the injustice my family caused yours." The apology was simple, direct, and utterly sincere. It was a gesture that chipped away at the wall of resentment Jessie had carried for 2 decades. "An apology is a start," she conceded, her voice steady. "The truth will be the repayment." A ghost of a smile touched Khalid's lips. "Indeed, and we have less than 48 hours until the board meeting to find it." He gestured to the journal in her hands. "That is our battlefield. What do we know?" For the next few hours, they bent over the journal together. The chasm that had separated them, of wealth, of status, of history, vanished, replaced by a shared, desperate purpose. Jesse's deep, academic knowledge of history and linguistics intertwined with Khalid's intuitive understanding of his own family's lore and his razor-sharp strategic mind. She translated a line of ancient poetry. He recognized it as a story his grandmother used to tell about a specific oasis in the desert. He pointed out a recurring symbol. She identified it as a marker used by 12th century cartographers. It was a dance of two minds, a lock and a key finally finding each other. They argued, they debated, they cross-referenced maps on a tablet with the cryptic clues in the journal. They were no longer a billionaire and a waitress. They were partners, equals. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Khalid ordered breakfast from a secure caterer. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them. "You know," Khalid said, looking at her over the rim of his coffee cup, "I laughed at you. When you said you spoke 9 languages, it was arrogant and cruel. But the truth is, I was envious." Jesse looked up, surprised. "I speak 5 languages," he continued, "and I use them every day as tools, to negotiate, to command, to persuade. But for you, they are not tools, are they? They are pieces of your life. They are who you are. My father paid for the best tutors in the world to teach me. Your father, he gave you the world itself." It was the most profound thing anyone had ever said to her about her gift. She had always seen her languages as scars, reminders of a life on the run. He saw them as a legacy. "He did," she said softly. "It was the only thing he had left to give." A discreet knock came at the door. It was Ferris. "Sir, the car is ready. The location is secure. We have also received the preliminary background report on Mr. Thorne. There are irregularities, shell corporations, sealed legal disputes, a history of hostile acquisitions with a very specific pattern." Khalid nodded. "He's not just a corporate raider. He's a professional grave robber in a Savile Row suit." He stood up and looked at Jesse. "It's time to go. Are you ready?" She closed the journal and stood beside him, her small frame radiating a quiet strength. "I have been ready for 20 years. As they walked toward the door, Khalid paused. "When this is over," he said, his voice serious, "your father's name will be cleared. I will see to it personally that the academic world knows Andrei Petrov not as a thief, but as a hero who saved a priceless piece of world heritage. That is my promise to you." Tears pricked Jessie's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She simply nodded, a universe of gratitude passing between them in that one small gesture. They stepped out of the office together. Ferris and Omar, who had been waiting with a mixture of confusion and anxiety, now looked at them with a new understanding. They saw not a boss and a waitress, but a team, an alliance forged in the crucible of a shared, dangerous past. As they descended in the silent express elevator, leaving the glittering heights of London behind, Jessie felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her father was alive. The quiet, anonymous life she had built for herself was over. The gilded cage of Aurelia had been unlocked. She was no longer hiding from her past. Alongside this unlikely, powerful ally, she was stepping out to meet it, ready to reclaim her father's honor and finish the fight he had started 2 decades ago. The game was afoot, and for the first time, the odds felt even. The story of Jessie and Khalid didn't end when they left that office. It was just the beginning. It reminds us that behind every face, there is a history we cannot see, and that the most unassuming person might hold the key to the most extraordinary secrets. Theirs is a testament to how a single moment of truth can shatter decades of lies and forge the most unlikely of alliances. What started with a condescending laugh in a restaurant became a high-stakes battle against a powerful enemy, fought not with money or weapons, but with ancient languages and a daughter's unwavering love. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their job or appearance? What hidden depths do the people you meet every day hold? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a story of hidden strength, and subscribe for more true-life dramas that prove reality is often more incredible than fiction.